Hello and welcome everyone to today's Careers in Finance webinar for students starting the Masters in Law and Finance in September 2018. We hope that you can see a picture at this stage and you can hear us. If there are any problems at all, that you'll see in front of you a Q&A button. If you send us through a message with any difficulties you're having in engaging in the webinar today, we'd be grateful. My name's Joanna, I'm the Senior Administrator for the MLF. I work with the MLF administrative team based at the Law Faculty, and I'm joined today by John Madrick, who will be presenting the webinar for us. John is the Head of Finance Careers here at the Careers Service at the Said Business School, and he leads a team of very experienced careers advisor who no doubt many of you will be meeting when you arrive here in Oxford. Prior to arriving at the Said Business School, John spent 15 years in fixed income sales and trading before spending time in investment, banking and asset management recruitment, both in agency and in-house. In the 2 years prior to joining the business school, he spent time as the interim head of recruitment at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and also undertook a professional qualification in career management. Today, John will take you through an overview of the finance industry and explain where MLF students typically sit. He will also give some advice about how best to prepare for recruitment opportunities. And as the webinar goes on, please do also remember that you'll have the opportunity to ask questions at the end, again using that Q&A button that you should be able to see on your screen, and we'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of the session. So John, over to you.
Thanks, Joanna, and hello and welcome to the MLF Finance Careers webinar. As Joanna already points out, I'm part of the career development team here at the business school, but maybe one of the key points to alert you to right from the start is that you guys are in the very fortunate position of being able to have access to any career support here at Said, but also you get access to the career support at the wider university's careers service, the Oxford University Careers Service, which you'll soon discover, no doubt, once you're here on the Banbury Road. And so that means you get clearly double access to people like me and others in the various teams. You get double access to all the resources, both physical and online resources, and you get double access to job boards, for example. So you'll have a great opportunity to engage with careers when you feel it is ready to do so. So I'm going to spend the next 20 or 30 minutes giving you a sort of 30,000 foot whistle-stop tour of finance here at Oxford. We'll take a look at an overview of the finance industry. As Joanna pointed out, we'll have a quick look at where MLFs typically fit within that landscape. Talk about recruitment timelines, things to start thinking about now, which I guess is the key point of this webinar. How can you prepare yourselves between now and an arrival later in the year? The resources available to you, and then just some quick tips on application process and CVs. Lots of students come to the business school, whether they be MLFs or Masters in Financial Economics or indeed MBAs, intent on trying to forge a career in banking. But I know it's quite an obvious thing to point out, but finance is so much more than banking. Of course, we have the classic two sides of an investment bank, the M&A, corporate finance advisory side, and then the sales, trading, research, if you like, the markets side of the business, which lots of people want to tilt at. But clearly there are many other functions in that landscape. And broadly they fall between what we call the sell side and the buy side. The buy side is the investment side, really, where you'll find your institutional asset managers, your private equity funds, your hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, etc. But along that and the peripheries of that, you clearly got other things like the development banks, which are much more keen on project finance skills. You have rating agencies, the regulators, both in-house and standalone regulators. The whole new exciting world of fintech. You know, the many students are coming wanting to disrupt the financial services industry and be a player in that, either in the standalone fintech startups or indeed embedded in the banks themselves. We've got the regulators in the UK. That's people like the FCA, the SEC, and the Prudential Regulation Authority. And other things like the transaction advisory arenas of the big four, PwC, EY, Deloitte, etc. So don't get married to any particular one. Your time between now and arrival is best spent reading up about some of these different areas, trying to network with people in those areas on a bit of a discovery voyage to find out where you might best fit. That said, there are certain areas of finance that MLFs typically fit into quite nicely, and that it does include the M&A departments of investment banks. It particularly includes the sort of distressed debt and restructuring arenas of both investment banks and indeed boutiques and private equity firms, because they value some of the detailed analysis and in-depth understanding of some of the legal issues involved in that type of business. Leverage finance too, private equity more generally, and of course the compliance and regulatory arenas. And what are employers typically looking for when they are looking at Masters of Law and Finance students, particularly those students that have coming with a legal background but maybe no specific or particular experience of having worked in a financial institution before? Well, the things they're valuing are the things that you can see on the screen here. Your attention to detail, your persuasiveness, being able to construct clear arguments, your negotiation skills, the analytical skills that you'll have been using, and the problem-solving skills. And then also, many employers, when they're facing you sitting across the desk, once you've passed the sort of technical hurdles, if you like, they're looking at you, particularly you guys coming from such a high prestigious course and in a high prestigious university. They're looking for you to take on future senior management roles, and for that they're looking at those softer skills, your ability to empathise, your ability to use tact, all those skills that at a senior management level will be more and more important as you go through your career. So those are some of the things that maybe you want to think about when you come to writing CVs, when you come to writing application forms, when you come to writing cover letters, some of the things that you may want to intertwine into that narrative, to draw some of those transferable skills out. And if we look at 6 key points that employers look for in students that are coming and aiming for finance careers, the first and foremost is a passion for finance. To a certain extent, it does not matter whether you've had that internship experience in a bank or an asset management firm or a private equity firm. But what does matter is that you can demonstrate and talk about a passion for finance, and be able to demonstrate some sort of experience, or maybe more importantly a plan to close the gap in terms of some of the skills you think you will need. And so gap analysis will be quite a big part of what you should be trying to work out between now and arrival. And then of course, once you're here during the MLF itself, you'll have all the core courses that are relevant and some of the electives that are relevant to the specific areas of finance that you want to pursue. But don't forget that softer side. Don't forget your ability to build up your leadership skills. You can do that in a number of different ways. You can do that by getting involved with societies and clubs. You can do that by, for example, joining competitions and challenges to get used to that ability to present in a thoughtful and logical way. All that, of course, is wrapped up in the communication skills, which hopefully will be a big part of your year here in Oxford. And underscoring that, the sixth and maybe one of the most important aspects are the technical skills that you can start building up. And again, most employers will not expect you to come oven ready, so to speak, with financial technical skills. But they will expect you to have had a real good attempt at trying to develop those. That could be, for example, by doing some of the modules on Wall Street Prep. It could, for example, be by joining the Saïd Business School's Asset Management Masterclass. It could be by trying to get a place on the Oxford Saïd Finance Lab. So lots of things you can do that will help your case without necessarily having had any previous financial experience. Let's have a quick look at how the how the industry typically hires. The top line is probably the most relevant for you, but equally lines 2 and 3 are important. The top line really refers to the structured graduate programs that exist, whether you fit into the early entry level, which we call the analyst programs at most of the banks, or indeed if you were sort of 5.5, 6 years experience, you may fall into an associate level position, which is typically where MBAs might fit in. And if you have more experience than that, again, then you're probably looking at lateral hires, that bottom line there. But I guess the most important thing to notice in terms of the top line for the structured programs is that they start very early, particularly with the banks, the big bulge bracket banks, the Goldmans, the Morgan Stanleys, etc. They open their programs very early indeed, and they seem to be getting earlier every year. I was looking at Goldman Sachs almost by accident yesterday, and they already have opened their analyst positions in various regions, including EMEA. They opened them on July the 1st this year. Others will open during August, some later, but earlier in September. But all of them pretty early. So some of them may well be, a couple of months, 2 or 3 months into the application process before you've even arrived. So please be aware of that, and if you are interested in particular firms, I urge you to get onto their websites and look at them regularly to make sure you know when the various programs will begin. And the most important part of that is that most of the banks will hire on a rolling basis, i.e. they will fill their seats when they see good people. So you may be one of the best candidates out there, but if you have applied much later in the cycle, then it may well be that those seats have already been filled. So there is a distinct advantage in applying early if you feel you're ready. Opportunistic hiring is more business needs related. Most of the private equity, hedge fund, venture capital firms hire in that manner, and some of the smaller boutiques, and they can take place really from a little bit later in the year and from next January onwards. And lateral hires will happen throughout the year on an ongoing but ad hoc basis. Excuse me. Okay, so that's how the industry typically hires. Let's have a look at some of the softer things that you may want to consider when choosing your career. Lifestyle is clearly a big aspect of of what you will be looking to do, that work-life balance. Many of the investment banking careers, for example, in M&A, don't give you much of the signpost on the right, and give you an awful lot of the signpost on the left. You know, you can be working 90 to 100 hours per week as an analyst in investment bank. So think carefully whether that is you or not. And similarly, think carefully about the general work environment, in terms of whether you want to work, for example, in a big firm with a hierarchical promotional structure, or whether you want to work in a much smaller firm that is, if you like, has a much flatter structure to the way it treats its staff. Do you want to work in a big international global firm, or a more regional firm, for example? Excuse me. Think too about the products you want to get involved in, maybe the underlying asset classes of what you do. If you want to work in debt, if you want to work in equities, are they fundamentally asset classes that you really do get a kick out of? Because ultimately what you're working with, the products you're working with, you've got to have a real interest in those in order to, you know, have a longevity to your career. Think about the type of person you are. If you're a natural communicator, a natural people person, you may want to think about something slightly more business development related or salesy. If you're not, we all have clients, obviously, whether they be external or internal, but you may want a quieter, more analytical research type of role. Think too about some of the geographic and cultural preferences, and be smart around those in terms of what might be aligned to your own background. It may well be that there are jobs that look really nice in the UK, but you may have a much better ability to get that job in the region that you're coming from. And other things too, maybe thinking about the long-term career prospects of the industry you're going into, how much life does it have left in it, and think too about, again, some of the project work that you may do that could last a long time. Are you that type of person, or do you want more instant gratification than that, and deal with products that are able to give you a sort of solution pretty quickly? So those are some of the sort of softer things to think about in terms of finding the right role. We'll look now, excuse me, I've got a nasty frog here, at your preparation between now and arrival. Have a touch upon the application process, and we'll finish off with some CV tips. That's the big message, starting early. We were just talking off air before the webinar arrived, Joanna and I, and we were both relaying stories about how students find it really quite all-consuming once they arrive in Oxford. There's an awful lot to do, there's an awful lot to see and get involved in. So the earlier you can start your preparation, particularly around career, and particularly if you're making that three-step change from maybe a regional change, a role change and an industry change, then the more preparation you can do ahead of arrival is going to be very beneficial to you. So begin the process now if you haven't already done so. Focus on what you want to leverage, the easiest things for you to leverage. That might be a language, it might be a particular industry background. And if you're serious about finance, there's no excuse for being technically behind the curve. As one of my old bosses used to say, become a finance ninja. There are plenty of resources available for you, including Wall Street Prep, and for those of you who get on the lab, the financial, the finance lab, or one of the asset management classes, there are plenty of resources available for you to get up to speed on some of the technical aspects of finance. And as I mentioned before, do that gap analysis. There are some appendices at the end of this deck which we won't go into on the live webinar, but will be available once the webinar is posted and the PowerPoint deck is posted, so that you can see various job descriptions of different roles across the financial services sector. And if you've got some idea already of what area of finance you want to go into, have a look at those roles, see what the job descriptions are pointing out as the skills and competencies that are required, and ask yourself seriously, have you got them? And if you haven't, start thinking seriously about how you're going to attain them, if you are indeed serious about going into some aspects of this world. So do that gap analysis. And network. Network like crazy. LinkedIn can help you with that. I would advise that if you haven't already done so, that on your LinkedIn page you put that you are an incoming Masters of Law and Finance student. That will help you link in with the Oxford community, either the wider undergraduate community or indeed the alumni of both the law faculty and the business school. And it's slightly like kissing frogs. You have to kiss a lot of them to find your prince, but actually once you do, they can be extremely useful, and people can be both extremely friendly and extremely helpful to you. And if you do get a good conversation going, quite often those can lead to introductions or just being referees when you actually start to get to the application process for many of the institutions. So networking is really important. And start reading now. Read the FT or the Wall Street Journal or the Economist every week, every day, as far as the FT is concerned, and start immersing yourself in the context of what it is that you're aiming to do. As an experienced recruiter, I can tell you straight away that it's very easy to detect somebody who's picked up the FT, for example, just 3 days before their interview. Those that read it on a regular basis will get a breadth and depth to their understanding that they'll be able to hold sensible conversations with senior management around issues that are relevant to that particular field. And that will show through very clearly. You don't have to be right. There is no wrong and right in this particular world necessarily, but you do have to be informed, and all it does really is underscore your passion and interest for wanting to do that work with that firm. And that's a key point in any interview. If you don't show that, you could be the most technically gifted candidate there is, but if you don't show a want and a willing and a passion for the work and the firm, then you won't get an offer. Some other things to think about whilst you're here. Utilise the resources at your disposal, both at the business school, both through the Oxford Careers Service, and indeed the law faculty and your colleges. Some great opportunities to develop the networking amongst those communities. Think about whether you want to do the finance lab. Think about whether you want to do the asset management masterclass, which will open up I think once you're here in October. Take part in any of the relevant competitions and conferences, again for various reasons, and I've touched upon them already. It helps in part to build your confidence in terms of presentations. It helps to underscore your interest in what you're aiming and tilting to do, which is so key to a would-be hungry employer. So get involved in what we call the Oxford Business Networks, the Finance Club, the Private Equity Club, the wider university societies, etc. There'll be great sources of potential employment for you, and there'll be great sources in terms of information and networking. I won't dwell on networking again, but you can see why it's there bolded in red. And if you're going to, if you feel you're ready, and it's fine if you're not, there are some great jobs that are being picked up by MLFs, MFEs, MBAs at the end of their year, because they really want to focus on their academics. But if you feel you're ready, then work earnestly and hard to try and get things nailed down as soon as you can. And finally, you may have to think about doing an internship. In fact, in the banking world, you're most likely to apply for an internship, because that's the way that banks like to hire their full-time employees. So unless you're coming with specific relevant experience, my advice if you're wanting to go into banking would be to apply for the internships, not the full-time roles. Okay, the application process, the online application process, and indeed beyond that, it consists of either all or certainly a lot of these various elements that you can see on the screen in front of you. Most often it'll be kicked off by some sort of online testing, both verbal and non-verbal reasoning. You can practice some of those before you arrive. One of the main suppliers to a lot of the banks is a firm called SHL, and you can Google that and you can get some free practice on those, so that you're at the very least not put off by the structure of them when you come across them. And I think also the Oxford Careers Service has some useful and free online resources for some of the verbal and non-verbal reasoning tests as well. So do practice that, because they're a very common part of the application process. Those, if you're successful, will probably be followed by either a telephone call or increasingly a video interview. A number of firms use different platforms to do that, but a video interview will normally consist of you speaking to a live camera. You'll get 5 or 6 questions thrown at you. You'll have probably a minute to digest each one, and then a couple of minutes to respond, and then you simply go on to the next one. There are various resources and support we can give you with that here, but there's again some good resources on the Oxford University Careers Service website too. Increasingly, you will have you'll probably end up with an assessment centre, either a day, sometimes even 2 days. Assessment centres you may or may not have come across before, but they tend to have various elements to them. They will include one-to-one interviews again. They will include increasingly a retesting of some of the verbal and non-verbal reasoning tests, just to make sure that you haven't somehow cheated in the first application, online application. They will test your group work by putting you together in group discussions to see how you communicate with fellow applicants around the table. And they'll probably test your presentation skills as well, either in groups or individually. And we'll also clearly have an element of one-to-one interviews as well. And hopefully all that at the end of that period will end up in an offer for you. Some quick tips about CVs. there is again plenty of help and support you can receive before you even get to Oxford, either by reading some of the online information or indeed by reaching out to us direct if you so wish and are ready to write a CV. But here are some basic tips, if you like. Make sure it's on one page. You guys, I'm assuming, do not have enough experience yet to spill over onto two. I'm not married to a one-page CV, but if you put it on a one page, it does help focus your mind on what is really important and salient, and it helps the recruiter too, particularly for the bigger programs where recruiters are receiving literally hundreds, thousands in some cases CVs to sift through. So try, if you can, to put it onto a one page. No photos. We don't do that here. It's not allowed these days. No date of birth, and try and keep it just in simple black and white form. No sort of fancy colours, if you like. So basic message, simple format, no jargon. Some of the recruiters will not have come from your backgrounds. They won't know specific industry jargon. So don't confuse them, make it simple. And very importantly, where you can quantify your impact. We're all very used to telling people on our CVs what we do and maybe what our responsibilities are, but we're very poor at actually telling the reader what the impact of what you did had on a particular business. So where you can quantify what you did, that might be you saved the business money, it might be you increased sales, it might be anything around that. Quantify it where you can so that you can really draw out the impact that you had in the things that you've been doing. And very importantly, also align your CV with the various job description, and make sure that the skills and competencies asked for in the job description you are hinting at, if not stating, in your CV in some way. It is the case that you will have probably a standard CV that you might want to show somebody, but in fact you should be tailoring your CV and making it bespoke to every different application you put out there. And also interests and hobbies, just be a little bit careful. They're funny things, interests and hobbies, in the sense that it can potentially be an icebreaker. It can be a great connector maybe with somebody who's interviewing you, on the basis that, on the off chance that they have the same sort of interest and passion that you have. But try and give that some impact as well. In other words, if there's something you can have achieved or gone the extra mile in terms of an interest or a hobby, bring that out, because again it shows that you are a better candidate than maybe the person that they'd flicked through earlier. Okay, some additional sources for further reading there. As I say, the slide deck will be made available in, I guess, in a couple of weeks' time. So no need to sort of print screen these now if you don't wish to. But really some useful stuff there for you to get ready and start reading, etc. And I can't emphasise it enough. You will find your world's turned upside down once you arrive in terms of how busy you will be. And if there is one, I guess, common a piece of advice that students at the end of the year give, it's I tell these guys to start early. I wish I had. So please take note of that. So in other words, don't be tempted to read the latest fictional #1 bestseller over the summer holidays. Start reading the FT. Okay, so that's it. I promised a whistle stop tour. I think you've had one. More than happy to answer any questions you may have. If you can try and make those questions generic, i.e. sort of open and relevant to all, if you can, rather than highly specific, I'm more than happy to take highly specific questions about you in particular and your circumstances in particular offline. But for the purposes of the webinar, if you could try and keep them generic, I'd be very grateful. And you can use the Q&A box there to to filter through your questions.
Just while we're waiting for the questions to come through, we'll also add as well that when the MLF students arrive in Oxford in September, part of your induction programme is actually a dedicated careers induction day, where there'll be a number of sessions where lots of people from lots of different backgrounds will be there to provide some advice and guidance, including John, about a range of fields that you might be interested in. So again, I suppose it helps that by doing as much preparatory work now as you can then come along to those sessions as well come September and be fully prepared for them too. Okay, we've got our first questions just coming through, John.
How does one apply for the Asset Management Masterclass? Has it opened yet? No, it hasn't. It's not like the Finance Lab. The Finance Lab, I know a number of you have applied to already, which is great. The Asset Management class won't actually open up until you're here. And I don't know the detail, I'm afraid. One of the faculty members runs that. I can tell you that the person that actually gives the Asset Management Masterclass, which I think is 3 hours each week over a period of 7 weeks, is Martin Taylor, who's quite a famous hedge fund manager, ex-Oxford alumnus. So he will be doing it again. I think it will be happening on a Wednesday, but more details on your arrival. And if I do receive more details ahead of that, I'll let Joanna know.
Another question here. Someone's asking, when we're talking about starting preparation early, could and should our current offer holders be thinking even about making their applications at this stage before they arrive in Oxford?
Yes, if you feel you're ready. In other words, if you are pretty sure about what you want to do and have gone through some of those preps advice that I've just gone through, then yes. Clearly, as I said, a lot of the banks, for example, will hire on a rolling basis, so there is an advantage to going early. But make sure that you are ready enough to do that, and clearly I can help and my colleagues can help with some of the basic stuff ahead of actually meeting you. We can do that remotely, so do feel free to reach out if you feel you're ready to do so.
And another question here for you, John, as well. You're asked, based on your experience, how you believe the MLF graduates are regarded amongst finance professionals?
Well, from my experience, pretty highly, I have to say. I've personally always been impressed by the makeup of the MLF class. There's been no different this year, and I very much doubt it'll be any different next year. And the MLF, from an employer point of view, is going to be a very attractive proposition. I think we have to communicate it slightly better than we maybe have been doing in the past. But most employers that I go into are asking for something I can't provide, in the sense that they're asking for people from a broad range of different undergrad degrees. So clearly I'm dealing a lot with students who are doing a master's in, for example, financial economics. But really they love more lawyers, more musicians, more classicists, etc. So I think some of the things that you come with, some of the skills you've built up because of your legal training will hold you in great stead. You just got to learn to communicate it, and I think we can help you with that. So I have no doubt that employers regard MLFs very, very highly indeed.
I'm not sure if I've misunderstood this question. If I have, perhaps the person could resend it in. It's a question about whether there are opportunities specifically for MLF students. So I think the question is, are there application rounds that are purely for MLF applications that you're aware of, or are they general graduate intakes that they need to be aware of?
No, there'll be general graduate intakes in 9 times out of 10. I think some of your current class who come from a particular country, like Holland, have managed to get themselves on a Dutch sponsored trek, if you like, around some of the investment banks this year. But that's based more around country of origin rather than sort of academic discipline. So no, unless they open up some specific program for lawyers that where you want to go in house and do law work, then no, you'll be regarded in the round of applicants that come from everywhere, from every academic discipline.
A question here about the elective choices within the MLF. We have someone asking whether opting for the finance stream would be at an advantage when compared to the law stream if someone was looking for entry-level positions in the finance sector.
I think at the margin, yes, and I think that's why most of the students that take that finance stream do it. Simply because it'll just immerse you more in what you're doing. I think if you're coming out of an MLF and going and continuing along the legal lines, absolutely fine. Without doing the finance stream though, and proving that to a finance employer might be just slightly harder. I don't think it's impossible by any stretch of the imagination, but I think by doing the finance stream you just hold yourself in a little bit better stead for finance related applications.
A question here looking back at previous MLF recruitment. In your experience, have you seen MLF students being recruited by the hedge fund industry?
The answer to that is no, but that's nothing to do with being an MLF, I should point out. The hedge fund industry is one of those businesses that do not hire in any structured way. It's a very sort of business needs related way. As hedge fund, they get to know a lot of the analysts and the researchers at the various banks on the sell side, for example, and that's normally their hunting ground for employees. Most of the hedge fund community will have started off in a bank or an asset management firm at some stage. They still have a very good network into them, and that's really where they fish for their future employees. So they very rarely take direct from schools, i.e. no campus recruitment. Some do, particularly the ones where they're run by Oxford alumni, for example. Again, one of your current MLF classes really got involved to bring low-cost capital to campus this year, and they were hiring direct. But there's nothing that I haven't seen an MLF go directly into a hedge fund, and normally hedge funds would want to take you after you've got 2 or 3 years experience under your belt in an analyst position on one of the sell-side firms.
Question here about the finance lab. Do you believe that the Oxford Said Finance Lab would be a good fit for someone who perhaps comes from a more limited accounting or finance background? And do you think that the finance lab is structured in such a way that it complements the skills that the MLFs will be learning through their core courses when they arrive?
Yes, I do think it complements them. I wouldn't encourage you to think of the Finance Lab as the sort of panacea for all financial ills. The Finance Lab is very good for certain aspects of financial services. So if you're thinking of M&A, corporate finance, ECM, equity capital markets, debt capital markets, leverage finance generally, some aspects of restructuring, that type of world, then the Finance Lab is going to be very useful to you, both in terms of some of the daily skills you will need as an analyst, i.e. the financial modelling and valuation skills, but also the understanding of those businesses and putting those businesses into a commercial context. And indeed will give you a lot of networking opportunities as well, because, as you know, part of the offer of the Finance Lab is to have a lot of these firms come in and work with you on case studies, etc. And you'll get involved in some of those competitions and challenges that help sponsor the Finance Lab. So, I think it'll be very useful, but very useful for certain aspects of finance. It is not going to be great for an equity or debt analyst position. It's not going to be great for a sales or trading position. So you need to be a little bit careful, but if you're thinking about mainstream M&A, corporate finance type banking, or maybe private equity some years down the road, then some of that experience and exposure will be very useful to you.
Again, apologies. Another question where I'm not sure whether I'm reading the brief text in the right way, but I think the question is essentially whether, in addition to the materials that you've covered today, John, whether there are any other types of reading or external qualifications or anything else that the students should be thinking about doing to try to make themselves as competitive as possible by October.
I think one of the best things you can do is work through some of those Wall Street prep modules that I think you have access to now. That will give you some great grounding, as well as the networking, of course. But in terms of just if you like, technical understanding, context understanding, then Wall Street prep is probably going to be your best friend, along with a regular read of a very top class financial publication like the FT or the Economist or the Wall Street Journal. Those are the two best things in terms of practical understanding, I think, and in terms of daily understanding of what the job entails. The best thing you can do is try and network and talk to people who are actually doing it, maybe SBS alumni or university alumni.
And we have, I think, at the moment, it will be our last question, and it's asking what your experience has been with the MLFs in the private equity market for recruitment.
Again, I'm trying to think now. I've been here 3 and a bit years. I don't know one MLF that has yet gone directly into private equity, but again, that's no surprise to me. There are very few people that can launch themselves into private equity without some previous transactional experience. So private equity firms will tend to take from the banks. In fact, some of the private equity firms that come to the school will tell students to go away and work for 3-4 years at a bank and then knock on our door. Some do take directly, but those that take directly will be taking students who have very, very relevant direct experience, transactional experience already under their belt. And most of the MLFs that I've come across, I think all of the MLFs that I've come across have not had that pure transactional experience. It hasn't prevented them from joining investment banking, investment banks on internships and good programs, but it won't catapult you directly into a private equity career. That's a stepping stone approach, and I think you need to think about it in that way.
I think hopefully we might have time for one final question.
Mm-hmm.
Question asking whether in your experience there are MLF students who are securing positions in the finance industry in the UK, or whether the majority of those opportunities are arising in the students' own home countries, or whether you are seeing moves into London with the recruitment.
Okay. Most of the students that I see will want to apply to UK positions. Not because they're necessarily in love with the UK, but simply because that's at the moment is still where a lot of the banking opportunities exist. Now, it is true that this year, if I look at our Masters in Financial Economics students, then we have a number going back to Paris or back to Frankfurt, more so than in previous years. That may have something to do with the Brexit scenario, it may not. A little bit too early to tell. But the majority will apply for UK positions. You just need to be a little bit savvy about that, in the sense that if you're applying for internships, great, they will love you, hopefully, and you'll get a return offer. But if you don't, then and you're on a visa, then you need to think about, very carefully about applying for positions in your local region as well. So it's just stiffer competition. Most people will still tilt at UK positions, but you need to understand that if you have an equal footing in your own country of origin, and it has a strong financial services sector in it, then you may be better off looking more locally. It doesn't stop you from looking in the UK, but everybody is still looking as an employer in the UK to hire local people that they don't have to convert in terms of visa.
A follow-up question from our earlier question about private equity recruitment.
Yeah.
The question's arisen whether or not you would therefore recommend that an MLF student take the private equity course that sits within the finance stream, or whether you think that there may be other more suitable electives for somebody looking to move into private equity eventually, or who should the students speak to about elective choices complementing their recruitment goals?
Well, I think elective choices are very personal things. I would not want to advise any individual student on their own elective courses until I actually got to know them particularly well and understood what they were aiming for and tilting at. All I would say about the private equity elective is that it's it's run by a great guy who gets some great feedback from students, but maybe more importantly, understanding the private equity world, understanding what they do, how they do it, and the context within which they do it is going to be helpful, pretty helpful for a lot of different roles in and outside private equity. So I would imagine it's quite a useful elective to choose, not least because a lot of the skills that go into private equity are the same skills that go into investment banking, advisory, M&A, corporate finance type work, and that's where private equity firms tend to come fishing when they want to hire young talent. They will tend to go to people who've had 2-3 years experience in an investment bank.
Well, I think that's all the questions for today. I don't think we've missed any. If we have, then we will make sure that we respond to them directly in an email to those of you that we have missed. I don't think we've missed anyone. Equally, those of you that are watching this as a recording, if you think of any questions, please contact the MLF office and we'll be sure to pass your questions on for an answer at a later date. Or if following this webinar you suddenly think of something, please do get in contact with us and we will endeavour to get answers to your questions to you as quickly as possible. Otherwise, I think it remains to say thank you very much to John
My
for
pleasure.
his time this afternoon. Thank you to all of you who have taken time out to join us today. I know many of you also have commitments at the moment, so thank you for taking that time, and we look very much forward to meeting you all in September. Thank you.
Bye bye.